Picture this. It's the 3rd of October 2010, and somewhere in a Berlin government office, a bureaucrat is processing what appears to be a routine financial transaction. Germany is making a payment of $94 million to foreign bondholders. Nothing unusual about that in the modern global economy. Except this particular payment is closing out a debt that originated 92 years earlier, in the blood-soaked trenches of World War I. That final transfer, made on the 20th anniversary of German reunification, marked the end of one of the most catastrophic financial experiments in human history, an experiment that didn't just bankrupt a nation, but helped ignite a Second World War that would kill 50 million people. I've spent 30 years studying financial crises, and I can tell you this with certainty. The story of how World War I's debts contributed to World War II is not a tale of bankers conspiring in smoke-filled rooms to engineer conflict for profit. The truth is far more disturbing because it's far more human. It's a story of well-intentioned experts making catastrophic mistakes, of politicians choosing politically expedient solutions over economically sound ones, of a global financial system built on circular logic and wishful thinking, and of how economic desperation can transform ordinary people into followers of totalitarian movements. What happened between 1919 and 1939 should terrify anyone who cares about democracy because it shows exactly how fragile our systems really are. Let me take you back to the 28th of June, 1919, to the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the same room where Otto von Bismarck had proclaimed the German Empire 48 years earlier, after Prussia's humiliating defeat of France. Now the tables had turned, and the symbolism was deliberate. German representatives arrived to sign a treaty they had no power to negotiate, only to accept. What they signed that day was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which placed sole responsibility for the Great War on Germany and its allies. Based on that legal foundation, the victorious powers would soon demand compensation for all the death and destruction of 4 years of industrial-scale warfare. The numbers, when they finally came in 1921, were staggering. 132 billion gold marks, roughly $33 billion in 1921 currency. In today's money, adjusted for nearly a century of inflation, we're talking about over $500 billion. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire gross domestic product in 1921 was approximately 40 billion gold marks. The Allies were demanding more than 3 years of Germany's total economic output to be paid over decades, while simultaneously stripping the country of 13% of its territory, a quarter of its coal mines, and 3/4 of its iron production. There was a British economist named John Maynard Keynes who attended the Versailles Conference as part of his country's delegation. Keynes quit in disgust and wrote a book predicting economic disaster. Most people ignored him. A French military officer named Ferdinand Foch was even more prescient. He reportedly said the treaty was not peace, but an armistice for 20 years. That prediction would prove accurate to within weeks. Germany couldn't pay. Of course, Germany couldn't pay. The country had financed the war by borrowing and by abandoning the gold standard, and its economy was shattered. When Germany defaulted in 1922, France's response was swift and brutal. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, intending to take coal and manufactured goods by force. The German government ordered passive resistance workers went on strike, refusing to cooperate with the occupiers. And to support those striking workers, to keep them from starving, the Weimar government did something that would haunt German collective memory for generations. They printed money. Not just some money. Unimaginable quantities of money. By November 1923, $1 American bought 4.2 trillion German marks. Think about that number. A trillion is already incomprehensible to the human mind, and this was over 4 trillion to 1. People needed wheelbarrows to carry enough cash to buy bread. Workers demanded wages twice a day because prices doubled between morning and evening. A postage stamp cost billions of marks. Life savings accumulated over decades vanished in weeks. The professional class, the solid middle-class families who had made Germany an industrial powerhouse, saw everything they'd worked for reduced to worthless paper. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a psychological catastrophe that broke something fundamental in the German psyche. Now, here's where American bankers enter the story, and their role is nothing like the conspiracy theories suggest. By 1924, everyone recognized the system was broken. Germany was ruined. France hadn't collected meaningful reparations despite military occupation, and the United States was getting nervous. You see, Britain and France owed America over $10 billion from war loans, and they were planning to repay those debts using German reparations. If Germany couldn't pay, the whole chain broke. So the Americans organized a committee of financial experts, led by a Chicago banker named Charles Dawes, to figure out a solution. The Dawes Plan that emerged in 1924 seemed brilliant at the time. Reduce the immediate payment burden on Germany, reorganize the Reichsbank under Allied supervision, create a new, stable currency called the Reichsmark, and, most importantly, loan Germany 800 million marks to restart its economy, with half coming from American banks, led by J.P. Morgan. The logic was elegant. Germany needed money to rebuild its industrial capacity, which would generate tax revenue, which would fund reparations payments, which would let Britain and France repay their American war debts. The initial loan was oversubscribed on Wall Street. American investors couldn't wait to throw money at German industrial projects. And for 5 years, it worked spectacularly. This was the era Germans remember as the Golden 20s. American capital poured into Germany, ultimately reaching 29 billion marks by 1929. New factories rose from the ruins, unemployment plummeted, industrial production jumped 50%. Berlin became a cultural capital, famous for its nightlife, its art, its cinema. Germany's share of world trade exceeded what it had been in 1913, before the war. Walking through Berlin in 1928, you might have thought Germany had not only recovered, but was thriving. But here's what Charles Dawes and Owen Young and all those brilliant financial experts either didn't see or chose to ignore. They'd built a house of cards. Germany was only paying reparations by borrowing from American banks. Britain and France were only paying their American war debts by collecting German reparations. American banks were only willing to lend because Germany seemed prosperous. But Germany only seemed prosperous because American banks were lending. The entire structure rested on one critical assumption that American capital would continue flowing to Germany indefinitely. On the 24th of October, 1929, that assumption shattered. Black Thursday. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed, destroying billions in wealth in hours. By mid-November, American stock values had fallen by a third. Banks that had been lending freely suddenly stopped. Worse, they started calling in existing loans, demanding immediate repayment. And Germany, which had become more dependent on foreign capital than any other major economy, was uniquely vulnerable. The impact hit Germany like a tidal wave. Industrial production, which had finally recovered to pre-war levels, began plummeting. At the end of 1929, about 1.5 million Germans were unemployed. Not catastrophic yet, but worrying. Within a year, that number had more than doubled. By early 1932, it had reached 6 million. 6 million unemployed in a nation of 60 million people. That's 30% of the workforce, and remember, this was in an era with no comprehensive unemployment insurance, no food stamps, no social safety net beyond meager government handouts and private charity. I want you to understand what this meant in human terms. Workers who had been the best paid in Europe in 1928 were standing in bread lines by 1931. White-collar professionals who'd rebuilt their lives after hyperinflation wiped out their savings found themselves destitute again. Children died from malnutrition in a country that had been the world's second-largest industrial economy just 3 years earlier. Families were evicted from apartments they couldn't afford. Suicide rates soared. This wasn't just economic statistics, this was mass suffering on a scale Germany hadn't experienced even during the war itself. Then came the banking crisis of 1931, and things got even worse. It started in Austria in May when Creditanstalt, the country's largest bank, collapsed. The failure spread like a contagion through Central Europe's interconnected financial system. German banks, which had expanded aggressively during the boom years of the late 20s, suddenly faced runs. In July, one of Germany's big four banks, Danske Bank, failed after a major borrower defaulted. Panic spread. Depositors rushed to withdraw money not just from Danske Bank, but from every bank. The German government had to declare a bank holiday, freezing all deposits for 3 weeks. When the smoke cleared, Danske Bank was gone and Dresdner Bank had to be rescued by the government. The German banking system, which had financed the country's 19th century industrialization, lay in ruins. Recent research has uncovered something chilling about that banking crisis. In towns and cities where local businesses had heavy exposure to the failed banks, Nazi Party vote shares jumped dramatically in subsequent elections. The correlation was especially strong in areas where the failed banks had Jewish leadership. The Nazis had been claiming for years that international Jewish finance was responsible for Germany's problems. Now they could point to failed banks and say, "See, we told you." It didn't matter that the banks had failed because of structural economic problems affecting the entire Western world. Desperate people wanted someone to blame, and the Nazis provided convenient scapegoats. Meanwhile, Germany's government was making the crisis infinitely worse through catastrophically bad policy choices. The Chancellor, Heinrich Brüning, was haunted by the hyperinflation of 1923. He feared inflation more than he feared unemployment, more than he feared social collapse, more than he feared Hitler. So in the midst of the worst depression in modern history, with 6 million Germans out of work, Brüning raised taxes. He cut government wages. He slashed spending on public works. He reduced unemployment benefits. This is called austerity, and in normal times it might make sense. But these weren't normal times. These were the worst of times, and austerity was poison. Every time Brüning cut government spending, aggregate demand fell further. Businesses had fewer customers, so they laid off more workers. Those workers couldn't buy goods, so more businesses failed. Tax revenue collapsed even as tax rates increased, making the budget deficit worse despite the austerity. Deflation accelerated, making debts more burdensome and destroying more businesses. Brüning's policies, implemented through presidential emergency decrees because the Reichstag opposed them, transformed a terrible depression into an economic apocalypse. Some historians believe Brüning was deliberately trying to prove Germany couldn't pay reparations by making the economy as bad as possible. Others think he was simply an ideological true believer in balanced budgets who couldn't adapt to crisis conditions. Either way, his policies were disastrous. And through all of this, the Nazi Party's electoral fortunes rose in lockstep with the unemployment rate. During the prosperous years from 1924 to 1928, the Nazis were a fringe movement polling around 3%. As unemployment began rising in 1930, they surged to 18% in September's elections. In July 1932, with unemployment at its peak, they captured 37% of the vote, making them the largest party in Germany. Their message was simple and powerful. Germany's problems came from the Versailles Treaty, from weak democratic politicians, from international finance, from Jews and communists and other internal enemies. Hitler promised to restore German honor, reject reparations, rebuild the military, and make Germany great again. For millions of desperate, unemployed Germans who'd seen their savings destroyed twice in a decade, these promises resonated with the force of salvation. The Weimar Republic's legitimacy had always been questionable in the eyes of many Germans, particularly conservatives and nationalists, who blamed it for accepting the Versailles Treaty in the first place. Now it proved utterly unable to address the economic catastrophe. President Hindenburg governed increasingly through emergency decrees, bypassing democratic processes. Political violence exploded as Nazi brown shirts fought communist paramilitaries in the streets. Democracy was dying, and most Germans seemed too desperate to care, or too paralyzed to act. On the 30th of January 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. The old president believed Hitler could be controlled, that including the Nazis in a coalition government would moderate them. It was one of history's greatest miscalculations. Within months, Hitler had consolidated dictatorial power, banned opposition parties, and begun implementing the totalitarian system that would lead to another world war. Now let me address the conspiracy theory directly, because understanding why it's wrong is crucial to learning the right lessons. Some claim bankers deliberately triggered World War II to collect debts. This is nonsense, and not just morally, but financially. American and European banks lost fortunes when Germany defaulted. The Dawes and Young bonds became worthless. American investors who'd poured billions into German industry during the 1920s saw their investments wiped out. Banks that had extended loans to German borrowers never recovered their principal. International financiers didn't profit from World War II. They suffered devastating losses from Germany's economic collapse. Charles Dawes and Owen Young and the other architects of the 1922 financial plans weren't villains. They were experts who genuinely believed they were stabilizing Europe. Their plans worked for several years, creating real prosperity. Their fatal flaw wasn't malicious intent, but structural design. They created a circular system dependent on continuous American lending that couldn't survive a major shock. When the shock came in 1929, the whole elaborate structure collapsed. And Hitler didn't start World War II to help bankers collect debts. His ideology, laid out explicitly in Mein Kampf and countless speeches, called for military conquest of Eastern Europe, establishment of a 1,000-year German empire, and elimination of European Jewry. These goals had nothing to do with reparations and everything to do with totalitarian racial ideology. Hitler actually stopped paying reparations when he took power, though interestingly Germany continued paying interest on the Dawes and Young bonds until war broke out in 1939. But, and this is the critical point, the economic catastrophe created by reparations, flawed financial structures, the Great Depression, and disastrous policy responses created the conditions that brought Hitler to power. Without the mass unemployment and economic desperation of 1930 to 1933, Hitler would likely have remained a fringe agitator, giving beer hall speeches to small audiences of malcontents. The web of international debts didn't cause World War II through conspiracy. It contributed to the war through failure. After World War II ended, the victorious Allies learned from these mistakes. Instead of imposing crushing reparations on defeated Germany and Japan, they implemented the Marshall Plan, providing aid to rebuild former enemies as well as allies. The result was unprecedented prosperity and stability. Instead of a fragile League of Nations, they created stronger international institutions, including the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Instead of punitive peace terms that bred resentment, they integrated Germany and Japan into the Western economic and political order. These weren't acts of charity, they were strategic decisions informed by the catastrophic failures of the interwar period. The lessons from this era remain profoundly relevant today. Punitive economic arrangements, however justified they may seem at the time, can backfire catastrophically. Financial systems built on circular flows and unsustainable debt are inherently fragile. Austerity during severe economic downturns typically makes things worse, not better. Economic catastrophe creates fertile ground for political extremism and demagogues offering simple solutions and convenient scapegoats. International cooperation and functional governance mechanisms matter enormously during crises. We're living through our own era of economic stress, rising inequality, political polarization, and threats to democratic norms. We have our own circular financial flows and over-leveraged institutions. We have our own demagogues blaming foreigners and minorities for complex economic problems. We have our own debates about austerity versus stimulus during economic downturns. The story of how the Great Depression helped bring Hitler to power isn't ancient history. It's a warning about what can happen when economic systems fail and democratic institutions prove unable to address mass suffering. There was no conspiracy, no bankers in smoky back rooms plotting to engineer a war for profit. What actually happened was more frightening because it's more plausible. Smart, well-meaning people made mistakes. They designed financial systems that seemed sound but contained fatal flaws. They chose politically convenient policies over economically sound ones. They failed to anticipate how economic desperation would make ordinary people receptive to totalitarian movements. And the result was the deadliest war in human history. That final payment Germany made in 2010, 92 years after the armistice, closed the books on one of humanity's most expensive mistakes. The total amount Germany actually paid in reparations came to about 36 billion marks by 1931, roughly a quarter of what was originally demanded. The rest was eventually canceled, reduced, or defaulted on. But the real cost wasn't measured in marks or dollars. It was measured in the 6 million unemployed Germans who turned to Hitler for salvation, in the 50 million dead from the war that followed, in the 6 million Jews and millions of others murdered in the Holocaust, in the nuclear shadow that still hangs over civilization. Financial crises aren't just about money. They're about the fabric of society, about whether democratic institutions can withstand economic stress, about what happens when desperate people lose faith in legitimate governance. The road to World War II was paved with loan agreements and reparation schedules, with deflationary policies and banking collapses, with unemployment lines and political radicalization. Understanding that road, in all its complexity and human failure, is how we avoid traveling it again.